Molly Corbett and her father, Thomas Martins, will spend more time in prison. A judge in Davidson County sentenced the pair to 4 to 6 years, but they will only serve 7 months to 2 years after getting credit for the 3 years and 8 months that they have already served.
He told his sister he was planning to leave. That something felt wrong in his own home. That he wanted to take his children and go back to Ireland, back to the life he knew before any of this. Tracy Lynch listened to her brother say all of this, more than once, in the months before his death. She had no way of knowing it would be one of the last real conversations they'd ever have. Weeks later, Jason Corbett was found dead in his bedroom in North Carolina. The people closest to him said it was self-defense. The evidence investigators found at the scene didn't fully agree. What happened next would take years to unravel through a conviction, a reversal, and a legal fight that reached the highest court in the state. 2 people would eventually be held responsible for what happened to Jason Corbett. How that happened, and what it actually cost them, is a story that surprised almost everyone who followed it. Jason Corbett was born in 1976 in Limerick, Ireland, into a close, traditional family. He grew up alongside his twin brother, Wayne, and his sister, Tracy, in a household his sister would later describe as full of warmth. He wasn't a complicated man, and that was never a small thing. He worked steadily for a packaging company, a job he cared about and was good at. By every account, he moved through the world without ego, the kind of person people simply like being around. He met Margaret Fitzpatrick, known to everyone as Mags, through a mutual friend one night out in Limerick. Those who knew them both said it felt inevitable almost immediately, the kind of pairing that made sense before either of them had said much of anything. Jason had never thought of himself as a romantic. Mags changed that. They married in 2003. Their son, Jack, was born the following year. 2 years after that, their daughter, Sarah, arrived. For a few years, nothing about their life together was dramatic. It was just quietly, steadily happy, the kind of happiness you don't fully notice until you look back on it. That happiness was the foundation everything else in this story would be built on top of, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because of how quickly it was about to be tested. Coming up, the sudden loss that would define the next chapter of Jason's life, and the decision he made afterward that everyone who knew him still talks about. In November 2006, only weeks after Sarah was born, Mags suffered a sudden asthma attack in the night. Her sister Catherine was staying over and saw her reach for her inhaler moments before things turned serious. Jason got her into the car and raced toward the hospital, but she didn't survive the trip. He was 30 years old, suddenly a widower with a 2-year-old son and a 2-month-old daughter. What he did next told you almost everything about who he was. He didn't hand the children off to relatives while he processed his grief somewhere else. He visited Mags's grave nearly every single day, brought her flowers, read her the newspaper, told her how Jack and Sarah were getting on. He raised them largely on his own while continuing to work full-time. In 2008, needing help at home, Jason placed an advertisement for a live-in AU pair. Molly Martins, 24, from Knoxville, Tennessee, answered it and moved to Limerick. She came from a family with its own kind of credentials. Her father, Thomas, was a retired FBI special agent who also held a law degree. On paper, she looked like exactly the kind of stable presence a grieving widower might trust with his children. What started as a working arrangement didn't stay that way for long, and the shift that followed would end up reshaping every part of Jason's life, from where he lived to who was raising his kids alongside him. By 2010, Jason and Molly's relationship had moved from professional to personal, and that February, they got engaged. They married in Knoxville in 2011, and Jason made a decision that revealed exactly how far he'd go for his children's stability. He sold his home in Limerick, gave up his job, and relocated the entire family to Walburg, North Carolina, transferring within his company to a new position. He bought a house on Panther Creek Court, in a quiet Gulf community, for $390,000, funded almost entirely by the sale of everything he'd owned in Ireland along with his savings. He'd already rebuilt his life once. Now he was doing it again, this time for good, or so he believed. From the outside, the Corbetts looked settled. Jason worked, Molly ran the household. But according to Tracy, cracks had already begun to show. Jason told her more than once that he was unhappy, that Molly's behavior had become erratic, and that he wanted to bring the kids home to Ireland. In the will he'd written back in 2007, he had named Tracy and her husband David as guardians for Jack and Sarah. He never updated it after marrying Molly. Whether that was an oversight or something more deliberate, it would end up mattering a great deal. If you're finding this case as unsettling as I do, hit subscribe now, because what happens next is where the story stops being about a marriage and starts being about a killing. On the evening of August 1, 2015, Molly's parents, Thomas and Sharon Martins, arrived at the Corbett home for a visit. They settled into the basement guest room. Nothing about the evening struck anyone as out of the ordinary. At 3 in the morning, Thomas Martins called 911. "My daughter's husband got in a fight with my daughter," he told the dispatcher. "I intervened, and I think he's in bad shape." When the dispatcher pressed him, he said, "He's bleeding all over, and I may have killed him." The call lasted just over 14 minutes. Paramedics David Bent and Amanda Hackworth reached Panther Creek Court in under 10 minutes. What they found inside the master bedroom stopped them cold. Blood covered the walls and the bathroom. Jason was on the floor, and when they tried to move him, fragments of his skull came away in their hands. Hackworth would later testify to something else she noticed: his skin was remarkably cool to the touch, unusually so for someone who had supposedly just been attacked. At 3:24 a.m., paramedics stopped trying to revive him. Jason Corbett was pronounced dead. He was 39. Molly was found beside her husband, performing CPR, and paramedics had to pull her away. Here's the detail that would end up mattering most in the months ahead: neither Molly nor her father had a single visible injury. Not a bruise. Not a scratch. Nothing consistent with the violent, sustained struggle they were describing. Investigators were about to walk into that bedroom and start asking questions that the scene itself didn't seem to answer. Lieutenant Frank Young and Detective B. Smith arrived to process the scene, and what they documented didn't sit well with the account they'd been given. Their assessment found no evidence consistent with a rough, sustained fight, the kind two grown men wrestling for a weapon might leave behind. The blood evidence, in other words, was telling a different story than the people standing in the room. A few hours after being released from police custody, Molly paid roughly $5,500 to have the house professionally, industrially cleaned of blood. Around the same time, Jason's family was on a plane from Ireland. When they landed, they were told Molly intended to have Jason cremated before they could see him. Authorities intervened to block it. Molly only allowed the family access to his remains after they agreed, in writing, to cover the full costs of the funeral and returning his body home. On August 26, 2015, Jason was laid to rest at Castlemungret Cemetery in Limerick, beside Mags, following a service at Our Lady Queen of Peace Church. The forensic picture was only getting started, and the next round of evidence would be even harder to reconcile with a clean self-defense claim. Dr. Craig Nelson, the pathologist who performed Jason's autopsy, testified that he had been struck in the head at least 12 times. The skull damage was so extensive in places that Nelson couldn't put an exact number on the blows. Blood spatter analysis presented at trial suggested Thomas Martins had been standing over Jason as he swung, not defending himself from below, a detail the prosecution argued was difficult to square with a man simply protecting his daughter in the moment. Then came the toxicology. Trazodone, a sedative, turned up in Jason's system, a medication he had never been prescribed. Testimony at trial clarified the level detected was low, but the timing was hard to ignore. Molly had been given a prescription for that exact medication just 3 days before Jason died. No explanation was ever offered in court for why a sedative neither the defense nor the prosecution disputed Jason hadn't been taking somehow ended up in his blood. Investigators also learned Thomas Martins wasn't an ordinary father-in-law reacting in the moment. He held a law degree from Emory University and had spent 30 years as an FBI special agent, training that shaped how he spoke to police from the very first interview. his account returning again and again to his state of mind, the specific language a self-defense claim requires. A former colleague, Joanne Lowry, testified that roughly 2 months before Jason died, Martins told her directly that son-in-law, "I hate him." Investigators now had a body, a scene that didn't match the story, and a man who'd expressed hatred for the victim months earlier. What they didn't have yet was a courtroom, and that was about to change. In January 2016, 5 months after Jason's death, Davidson County prosecutors filed second-degree murder charges against both Molly and Thomas Martins. Jury selection began in July 2017 in Lexington, North Carolina, before Judge David Lee. District Attorney Alan Martin laid out the state's case. Injuries too extensive to count, a sedative Jason never should have had in his system, a house cleaned within hours, and a motive rooted in Jason's will and a $600,000 life insurance policy. Molly's attorney, Walter Holton, and Thomas's attorney, David Friedman, built their defense around self-defense, calling 5 witnesses to describe what they characterized as Jason's volatile temper, and playing secretly recorded audio of him raising his voice at Molly with the children audible in the background. Judge Lee ruled that statements Jack and Sarah had given police immediately after their father's death couldn't be used at trial, a decision the defense said crippled their case, and one that would end up mattering far more than anyone in that courtroom realized at the time. On August 9, 2017, the jury found both Molly and Thomas guilty of second-degree murder. Jury foreman Tom Oman said the panel had been nearly unanimous on Thomas from the start, and reached the same conclusion on Molly after reviewing the crime scene evidence. Judge Lee sentenced each of them to 20 to 25 years. It felt, for a moment, like the story was over. It wasn't. If you've made it this far, you already know this case doesn't end the way you'd expect, so go ahead and subscribe before we get into exactly how it fell apart. In 2020, the North Carolina Court of Appeals overturned both convictions, ruling that excluding Jack and Sarah's original statements had denied the defendants a fair trial. In March 2021, the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld that reversal in a narrow 4-3 vote. Molly and Thomas were released on bond, and a retrial was scheduled in neighboring Forsyth County. It never happened. As Jack and Sarah grew older, their account of that night changed. Now teenagers, they told the court that Molly, their stepmother and guardian at the time, had shaped what they told police as children. In her victim impact statement at the 2023 sentencing, Sarah described years of therapy grappling with the fact that her own childhood words had been used in an attempt to help the people who killed her father avoid conviction. The statements a court ruled needed protecting were, according to the people who gave them, statements they no longer stood behind. That reversal didn't end the case. It just changed what justice would end up looking like. If you want to know exactly how this case was resolved, stick around, because the ending here surprised almost everyone who followed it, and subscribe if you want more cases like this one every week. In October 2023, both defendants accepted plea deals. Thomas Martins pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Molly pleaded no contest to the same charge. The murder charges were dropped. Judge David Hall sentenced each of them to a minimum of 4 years and 3 months, with credit for the 3 years and 8 months they'd already served from their original conviction. What remained was roughly 7 months. By June 2024, both were released. By mid-2025, both had completed parole. Jack and Sarah have lived in Ireland since 2015, raised by Tracy and her husband, David, the guardians their father chose for them years before any of this happened. It was the same guardianship arrangement he'd written into his will back in 2007, quietly, long before anyone could have known how much it would come to matter. Jason Corbett rebuilt his entire life once, after losing Mags, purely for his children. He rebuilt it a second time, moving countries, for the same reason. He was killed in the home he built for them, and the 2 people responsible spent a combined total of under 4 years behind bars. Somewhere in Limerick, there's still a grave he used to visit every single day, rain or shine, for years, just to keep a promise to someone he loved. His children visit it now, and in a story with very few clean endings, that's the one thing that was never in question.